So, welcome back. In this final part of the lecture, I'm going to speak to you about media effects. So, that is sociological theories of the impact of the media on our everyday lives, on the population, essentially. So, you can probably guess that commentators and theorists don't necessarily agree about the impact of the media and what it means for our everyday lives, but some commentators argue essentially that the media essentially perpetuates a debased form of culture. So it's responsible for spreading ugliness, violence, sexual permissiveness, bad taste, that it's essentially responsible for spreading kind of social ills. And this type of view claims that mass media essentially kind of tranquilizes or distracts or perhaps even perverts the masses. So this is a view of the media, mass media that is, as kind of a low culture that is this kind of meaningless, trivial chatter that is distracting people from things that are actually important. And this fits within the kind of high culture, low culture debate that Steve spoke about in the week where it was discussing kind of subcultural debates. So I won't cover that in great detail, but essentially the point that I'm making here is that the media has been used as a kind of source of moral panic. So again, moral panic was covered in the week on youth culture and transitions. This is essentially kind of public panics or public outrage about certain kind of folk devils that are thought of as corrupting our social fabric and disrupting our ways of life and such. So the media are quite a regular kind of target for this sort of thing, and this comes from kind of both sides of politics. So it's not something that's a kind of left or right issue necessarily. It's it's something that's coming really from both sides. So a particular article that you might like to look at if you're interested is by Jessica Ringrose. I believe this is in the extended readings for the course. Essentially looking at something that comes up a lot in commentary on the media, the notion of sexualization, especially of teenagers, and Jessica Ringrose provides quite a good analysis of essentially how teenage girls are navigating and performing sexual identity on social networking sites, and the ways in which this has provoked certain kind of moral panics and what all of this really means, and how this gives us a wider reading of the media as this kind of debasing low cultural force. So this really stems from a view coming from the work of a group of neo-Marxist thinkers who are collectively known as the Frankfurt School. So again, this is material that was covered in the I believe in the Youth Cultures and Transitions Week, in which you spoke a bit about subcultures. So again, this particular school of thought, the Frankfurt School, essentially argued that popular culture was a low and debased form of culture that is ultimately a negative force for the population, that kind of removes the ability for the population to think critically and therefore stabilizes capitalism. So essentially, it distracts the wider population from being critical about the conditions that they're living in, and therefore it allows the system to be perpetuated and such. So this can be thought of as, in a very simplified way, a general theory claiming that the media is a socially negative force because it distracts us from what is important. It's not a particularly valuable form of culture, essentially. And we can We can contrast this with the view of cultural sociologists who take a much more positive view of the effects of the mass media. So, cultural sociologists working in this type of tradition generally highlight the ways in which different types of media can be empowering and can be political and are not simply instruments of control. So they very notably do this by highlighting the way in which media can be kind of involved in processes of resistance and empowerment, as well as being, involved in things that are trivial and banal. So we can think of, certain media products that have been very, very critical and very subversive and have challenged the status quo. And we can use these types of things as, evidence for this type of view of the media as, and not such a kind of negative force. And moving on from that particular theory, I think the next important area to discuss in terms of the effects of the media is, moving away from, theorists who are focused on the media itself, thinking like the media is good, the media is bad. We can move towards media audience theory, which starts to focus a bit more on the individuals that are consuming and interacting with the media. So the most important aspect of media audience theory is just the simple point that essentially the consumption of media is not a passive pastime. It's not that, it's not that people sit and consume media and just kind of passively accept everything they hear. Media audience theory would dictate that people are active in their engagement with the media. They are able to think critically about it. They don't just accept everything that they see. They, relate to it in a variety of different ways. So I think this is a particularly important perspective because, it moves away from thinking the media is bad because it conveys this idea and, thus distracts people from this or that. That particular theory or that particular approach to the media, it doesn't really think about the, people that are sitting at home and interacting with it. It doesn't think about the way in which we, the media can be telling us anything we like, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to agree with that. So, the kind of media is bad theories generally don't really give much credit to the individuals consuming the media and don't really think too much about, the ability of these individuals to not be entirely passive in their consumption or relation to the media. So essentially, media audience theory would dictate that individuals kind of synthesize media materials to make their own specific meanings and to interpret things in their own ways. And this is particularly vital, this particular insight. It's vital for understanding how trends and how new cultural forms emerge. So, if we were purely just consuming media, then you would think that all kind of trends would just come from the media itself. But if that were the case, why do we need to have these, these cool hunter kind of people, trend hunters from, emerging from the 1990s and still, around at present trying to find the next kind of cool thing? They're going not to kind of mass areas of cultural production. They're going to these kind of niche subcultural areas where, media is reinterpreted and new forms of meaning are made to try to, identify and capitalize on them. So I think that, if nothing else, is evidence of the creative way in which people can relate to media. So we can start to ask some really kind of critical questions using this type of perspective. For instance, what's the cultural meaning of certain television shows, or why do young women identify with characters from, television shows such as Home and Away? And like there's a range of quite interesting questions that we can ask about how people relate to the media, and there's entire kind of fields of research such as media and television studies that are doing this type of work, that are looking at, not only how the media kind of is created and what it means, but more so, how does our perception of an interaction with it, shape the media, and, essentially what is the effect of the media on us, not as a neutral kind of passive entity, but as, an active and creative participant in culture. So, following on from this, we can see that the kind of basic premise of a postmodern media analysis is that the media doesn't necessarily offer a reflection of reality, and it doesn't offer necessarily, a certain single kind of truth. Instead, we kind of watch the media and we look at media and we make our own meanings in many ways. So, according to kind of postmodern approaches to the media, postmodern analysis of the media, we, read and engage with the media in the same way that we engage with any other social interaction or relation. We use our own kind of social and cultural interpretive frames. We engage in specific discourses. So we can't really think of the media as something that's quarantined out of our everyday lives. The media is instead something that we relate to, in the context of our wider lives. And this again comes back to the particular role that popular culture plays in our lives. It's not something that we consume, it's something that, we interact with, and that's very central to our identities as, a footy fan or a beer drinker or any of those sorts of things. It's very much the same for, for media in terms of like traditional media, news media, social media, all of these different types of media. So, one of the kind of particularly interesting ways to analyze contemporary media is by looking at how the things that we consume through the media, because the media is something that's kind of very real to us in our day-to-day lives, by looking at the way in which the things we consume through the media can become real or even more real than the things that they apparently refer to. So this type of idea is stated quite well by Adorno and Horkheimer, who state that real life has become indistinguishable from the movies. And essentially, what they're referring to here is what we can call a simulacra, which is essentially a copy of something for which there is no exact original. So something that is perhaps, an image of something that isn't faithful to an original. So we can think of the type of nostalgia that we have, the kind of cultural nostalgia that we arguably have for a certain view of the 1950s, certain types of clothing and, certain kind of ways of acting and such. The very interesting thing about that is that those, the certain like fashion styles and such were not necessarily completely faithful to the time. In many cases, they're instead, things that we've seen in film representations that we then, equate with that particular time period. And, that to us is very much the reality of, 1950s means a hoop skirt, for instance. So that's probably not an amazing example, but essentially, the kind of theorists working around the idea of media and simulacra would argue that essentially the media that we consume, as we were saying, becomes kind of more real to us or just as real to us as the things that we encounter in our day-to-day lives. And we relate to these things as real. So An example of this are some pictures from a Las Vegas casino, which I'll show you next, where gamblers can essentially occupy this kind of ancient world and position themselves as noble members of this certain aristocracy. So you can see here there's this kind of interesting casino that it's like based on these kind of ancient world statues. So we can if we kind of build on this idea that we're not passive recipients of information from the media, and the media and things that we consume through the media are incredibly real to us, we can then build on that to look at the technological affordances of new media, what it essentially allows us to do. So especially new media, so online technology is the key example. New forms of media really thrive on collapsing the boundaries between the public and the private. So they allow us to do certain things. They give us certain opportunities, potentials, capacities to extend our everyday social worlds in ways that were not previously possible. So, social networking sites and instant messaging tools, we use them to communicate with our existing friends and families, but they also allow us to deepen relationships that are geographically distant, and they allow us a space in which we can communicate with our friends in ways that we didn't used to be able to. So they offer kind of new capacities for new forms of sociality and such. And we now have people having purely online relationships which are arguably as real to them as kind of face-to-face relationships. So this is another case of the media not being separate from our everyday lives, but being very much a part of our everyday lives. And it's an example of the kind of new affordances, the new things that these technologies kind of allow us to do. So essentially, to bring this all back together, and going back to the work of Manuel Castells, who's popped up a couple of times in this course, we are very much living in a network society in which we're all interconnected, and we can read the implications of this society and the effects of the media we interact with in a number of different ways. But hopefully the theories that I've taken you through give you some kind of insights of how we can view the media, the limitations of accounts that view the media as just being socially negative, and then some of the kind of helpful things that we can take from accounts that view the media as more of a creative and active space, and look at the ways in which the media that we consume is very real to us, and the ways in which it has new affordances for our everyday lives and allows us to do new things. All of these perspectives come together in a really interesting way to help us to understand our own positioning within a kind of contemporary networked society. It's illustrated beautifully by, I think, this image here. And I think the most interesting development that we've touched on a little bit this week is just the incredible pervasiveness of our kind of new media landscape in our everyday lives. We can essentially be part of a 24/7 instant news cycle unless we deliberately switch off from it. But then if we are switching off from that, we're cutting ourselves off from all of these affordances of new media, this ability to be in contact and connect with our loved ones. So arguably at present that's even more relevant than perhaps it was this time last year. Being able to keep in touch virtually, it's incredibly important to our well-being at this point in time. So I think that's a very, very important note to end on. So, really, in this day and age, no one necessarily escapes the media. And it's been argued that nothing is necessarily new. We're kind of recycling things, but we are arguably recycling them in new forms, creating these kind of simulacras of the past that we can live within that are incredibly real to us. And very much on that note, media and popular culture are always changing, they're always innovating, and the way in which we relate to them is always changing. So, really, I think an interesting question to end on is what comes first, the media trend or the demand for the media trend? And I think trying to unpick the relationship between media and popular culture, if we even can, is particularly difficult. So I'm not going to try to answer that question, but I'll leave you to think about it. So thank you so much for sticking with me through this lecture today. Hopefully this has been interesting for you and gives you some things to think about and some points to discuss in the tutorials this week. Thanks so much. Have a lovely week.